You can drink the same coffee from the same mug at the same time every morning and feel almost nothing after 60, while the chemistry in your brain is running a completely different program than it was 10 years ago. The coffee is not the problem. What changed is the system underneath it. Three specific biological shifts happen between your 50s and your 60s that make caffeine progressively less effective, and two of them are things your doctor will not mention because they fall entirely outside the standard conversation about just cut back if it bothers you. The third one is something the coffee industry actively benefits from you not knowing. What I am going to walk you through today involves a specific protocol I call the wake curve protocol. Three additions, three timing adjustments, and one common mistake that cancels all of it if you leave it uncorrected. I will tell you exactly what it is before this ends. But the protocol only makes sense once you understand the mechanism, and the mechanism starts with a molecule most people have never heard of, that your body has been making every single day of your life: adenosine. That is the molecule at the center of everything. Most people think caffeine is a stimulant in the traditional sense, that it adds energy to your brain the way gasoline adds power to an engine. That is not what happens. Caffeine does not generate energy, it blocks a signal. From the moment you open your eyes in the morning, your brain begins producing adenosine continuously. Every hour you remain awake, adenosine concentrations in your cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that bathes your brain and spinal cord, rise in a slow, steady accumulation. Adenosine docks onto specific receptor sites on neurons, and when it does, it delivers a clear message: slow down, reduce cognitive activity, prepare for sleep. The longer you have been awake, the more adenosine has built up and the more tired you feel. This is called sleep pressure. It is not a vague sensation of fatigue, it is a precise chemical measurement of how long your brain has been running. Caffeine is structurally similar to adenosine, similar enough that it fits into those same receptor sites like a wrong key that fits a lock without turning it. When caffeine occupies those sites, adenosine cannot dock. The sleep signal never lands. Your brain does not know it is tired because the docking ports are already occupied by an imposter molecule. You feel alert not because energy was added to the system, but because a warning signal was temporarily muted. Think of it like a smoke detector. The smoke is still there, the adenosine is still accumulating every hour without interruption. Caffeine unscrews the battery from the detector. The alarm does not sound, you feel fine. But the moment caffeine clears your bloodstream, and caffeine has a half-life of roughly 5 to 6 hours in a healthy younger adult, the battery goes back in, the detector finds all the smoke that was always present, and the exhaustion arrives in waves. This is what people call the afternoon crash. Not a caffeine crash in the strict sense, an adenosine reckoning that was temporarily postponed. The adenosine was never cleared, it was just blocked from being felt. This mechanism works reasonably well when you are 25. After 60, three separate things fracture it. The first is a slowdown in an enzyme most people have never heard of, CYP1A2. This is the primary enzyme in your liver responsible for metabolizing caffeine. Your liver processes caffeine through CYP1A2 the way a water treatment facility processes chemical input. It breaks caffeine down into its component metabolites, recovers some useful byproducts, and pushes the remainder toward excretion. In younger adults, this system runs efficiently. The half-life of caffeine is somewhere between 4 and 6 hours. By the time you go to bed after an 8 in the morning cup, most of the caffeine has cleared, but CYP1A2 activity declines measurably with age. Clinical pharmacology research has documented this across multiple cohorts. The practical consequence is that the same cup of coffee you drank at 40 stays in your body significantly longer at 65. Here is why this initially sounds like a good thing and is actually a slow-motion trap. If caffeine lingers in your system longer, it is occupying adenosine receptor sites for a longer window of time. Your brain's response to any molecule that persistently blocks a receptor is to create more receptors. This is called upregulation, and it is not a malfunction. It is your brain adapting rationally to a persistent chemical situation. The brain notices that the adenosine signal is being continuously suppressed and compensates by building additional receptor sites, more docking ports for the sleep signal. The result is that you now need more caffeine to produce the same degree of receptor blockade because there are simply more ports to fill. And while you are gradually increasing coffee intake to chase the same baseline feeling of alertness, the underlying system is ratcheting upward, more receptors, more adenosine pressure, and a progressively deeper dependence on caffeine to feel like yourself at a neutral baseline. The clinical pharmacology data puts this in stark terms. Caffeine half-life in adults over 65 can extend to 9 or even 10 hours, compared to 4 to 5 hours in younger adults. If you drink coffee at 8 in the morning, roughly half of that caffeine is still circulating in your bloodstream near midnight. This is one of the most underappreciated explanations for the sleep disruptions so many people over 60 report that they cannot trace to any obvious cause. They stopped alcohol, they go to bed at 10, they exercise regularly, they still wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, simultaneously wired and exhausted, unable to return to deep sleep. The culprit sitting in their bloodstream is a cup of coffee they drank before noon. And because their deep sleep is fragmented, the adenosine from the previous day never fully cleared, which means they wake needing more caffeine, which means the cycle gets one turn tighter. This is the invisible villain in the story of coffee after 60. Not the caffeine itself, but the slow accumulation of uncleared adenosine in a brain that is no longer sleeping deeply enough to run its own cleaning system. I will come back to the cleaning system in detail because it is the part that genuinely alarmed me when I read the research. But first, the cortisol piece, because this is the one that involves a behavior almost everyone over 60 is doing every single morning without knowing what it costs. The cortisol awakening response is something known within endocrinology and almost entirely absent from mainstream health communication. In the first 30 to 45 minutes after you wake up, your adrenal glands produce a sharp, clean spike of cortisol. Not the chronic, low-grade elevated cortisol that damages cardiovascular tissue and suppresses immunity. That is a different and genuinely dangerous phenomenon. The cortisol awakening response is a healthy, evolutionarily programmed burst that functions as your brain's internal alarm clock. It increases alertness, sharpens working memory, mobilizes blood glucose for immediate cognitive use, and primes the immune system for the demands of the coming day. It is, in biological terms, your body's built-in stimulant, the one your adrenal glands have been manufacturing for free since birth. Cortisol and caffeine activate some of the same downstream pathways. Both elevate norepinephrine. Both increase heart rate. Both sharpen attentional focus. When you drink coffee during the cortisol awakening response window, which is exactly what most people do, because the cultural norm is coffee immediately upon waking, you are layering caffeine stimulation on top of a system that is already spiking toward its peak. The caffeine is redundant. You are not amplifying the alert signal. You are flooding an already active circuit with an external chemical that mimics what the circuit was doing on its own. And your body, being rational and adaptive, notices the redundancy and begins reducing its own internal effort. Over months and years, the cortisol awakening response weakens, not because something is broken, but because the body stopped investing in a spike that was being consistently overridden by an external source. The research on this timing effect has been available in the neuroendocrinology literature for decades. Its practical implications, that drinking coffee in the first 45 to 60 minutes after waking suppresses your body's own stimulant axis, were described in the academic literature as far back as the 1990s. The recommendation that emerges from this research is specific. Wait approximately 90 minutes after waking before introducing caffeine. Let the cortisol awakening response complete its natural arc. Use that window for movement, protein, water, light exposure. Then drink coffee when the natural cortisol peak is winding down and external support is genuinely useful. After 60, the cortisol awakening response flattens independently of the coffee behavior. Multiple studies have documented that the amplitude of the CAR, its peak height relative to baseline, decreases significantly with aging. Some older adults show almost no measurable morning cortisol spike. This means the natural internal alarm clock that morning coffee was supposed to supplement has already been partially eroded, in part by decades of overriding it, in part by the aging of the HPA axis, the system involving the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands. The people who most need the cortisol window strategy are the people whose morning cortisol has already been chronically suppressed by the habit of not using it. The fix exists, but it requires changing the one ritual that feels most psychologically defended. This brings me to something I want to say plainly, because the psychology matters as much as the biology here. The morning coffee ritual is not sacred because of how it tastes. It is sacred because of what it represents: the transition between sleep and function, the first voluntary act of the day, the moment the brain decides it is ready to operate. That feeling of ritual importance is real, and it is not trivial. The problem is that the ritual has been encoded as coffee immediately, and that timing is the specific component that costs you. The rest of the ritual, the mug, the quiet, the few minutes of sitting before the day begins, that is fine. Neurologically useful even, because morning stillness supports the completion of the cortisol arc. The only thing that needs to change is the timing of when the coffee enters it. My husband figured out the 90-minute delay about 6 years ago, and I resisted it for nearly 2 years after that. I had told myself the ritual was helping when what I was actually defending was the habit. The distinction between defending a useful behavior and defending a familiar one is something I think about a lot, because it shows up everywhere in the health decisions people make after 50. The behavior is often not the problem. The timing is, the context is, the combination is. Understanding the mechanism is what allows you to separate the useful part from the harmful part without throwing away the whole thing. We have been told to drink coffee first thing in the morning. Every coffee brand photograph is set at sunrise. The cultural association between waking and immediate coffee is so deep it functions like a fact rather than a choice. But the cortisol awakening response was mapped in clinical research, and the implication that early coffee suppresses the body's natural stimulant production was available in the pharmacology literature long before anyone surfaced it to the people actually drinking the coffee. The information was not hidden, it was simply never considered commercially useful to share with consumers because there is no revenue model attached to telling someone to wait 90 minutes before opening a product they have already purchased. Now, the third shift. This one involves something called the glymphatic system, and it connects the adenosine story to the sleep story in a way that completes the mechanism. Sleep has a cleaning function that most people do not know exists. Your brain produces metabolic waste continuously: misfolded proteins, cellular debris, inflammatory byproducts generated by normal cognitive activity. During deep sleep, specifically during slow wave sleep, a system called the glymphatic system activates. Glial cells in the brain shrink slightly, widening the channels between them, and cerebrospinal fluid pulses through those channels in slow, rhythmic waves. This fluid acts as a pressure wash. It carries out accumulated proteins, including amyloid beta, the protein implicated in Alzheimer's disease, and including the adenosine that built up during the waking day. The glymphatic system is the overnight maintenance crew. It only works during deep, slow-wave sleep. During light sleep, fragmented sleep, or waking, the crew is absent. Slow-wave sleep, also called delta sleep or stage 3 sleep, declines sharply with age. Research published in the journal Cerebral Cortex found that adults over 60 demonstrate roughly 50 to 75% less slow-wave sleep than adults in their 20s. By the mid-60s, many people are spending only a small fraction of their sleep time in the deep sleep stage where glymphatic clearance actually occurs. This means adenosine from the previous day is not being adequately cleared overnight. You wake with a baseline adenosine load that is already elevated above where you would wake if you had slept deeply. Coffee helps you feel functional. It blocks the receptors, but the accumulated pressure underneath is higher than it was 20 years ago. When caffeine wears off, you fall back to a floor that is higher than it used to be. The crash is harder. The need for the next cup arrives sooner, and tolerance accumulates faster because the system it is fighting is running at a permanent disadvantage. The glymphatic failure closes the loop on the invisible villain introduced earlier. Every night of degraded slow-wave sleep contributes to a higher residual adenosine baseline the following morning, which demands more caffeine to address, which, if consumed late or in high volumes, further fragments the sleep architecture on which glymphatic clearance depends. The circle has no natural exit once it is established, but it has three very specific intervention points, which is precisely what the wake curve protocol is built on. Before reaching those, the magnesium piece needs its full explanation because it is one of the most underappreciated mechanisms in the entire system. Coffee is a diuretic. Its consumption increases urinary output, and increased urination increases the excretion of water-soluble minerals, particularly magnesium. A single cup of coffee can produce a measurable increase in urinary magnesium loss. This is documented in studies published in Magnesium Research and in multiple European clinical nutrition journals. Across 2 or 3 cups per day, over months and years, this cumulative depletion becomes clinically significant in ways that reach well beyond energy metabolism. Magnesium is a cofactor for over 300 enzymatic reactions. It is required for the synthesis of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the energy currency all cells run on. It is required for the function of NMDA receptors, the receptors most involved in memory formation, synaptic plasticity, and neurological learning. It is required for the conversion of tryptophan into serotonin and for the downstream conversion of serotonin into melatonin. When magnesium is depleted, melatonin synthesis is impaired. When melatonin production is inadequate, sleep onset is delayed and sleep architecture becomes shallow and fragmented. Shallow, fragmented sleep reduces slow-wave sleep time. Reduced slow-wave sleep compromises glymphatic clearance. Compromised glymphatic clearance leaves more adenosine in the brain the next morning. More residual adenosine demands more caffeine to function. More caffeine excretes more magnesium. The loop is precise and it compounds silently. After 60, magnesium absorption from the gut decreases independently of dietary intake. Research from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition has documented reduced intestinal magnesium transport efficiency in older adults. The intestinal channels responsible for active magnesium absorption, known as TRPM6 and TRPM7 channels, show decreased expression with aging. This means an older adult eating the same magnesium-rich diet as a younger adult absorbs less of it. The National Institutes of Health estimates that roughly 48% of Americans do not meet adequate magnesium intake from diet alone. In older adults who drink 2 or more cups of coffee daily without supplementation, that deficit is almost certainly more common and more consequential. Magnesium also plays a role in a system I mentioned earlier when discussing L-theanine, the GABAergic system. GABA is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, the compound that calms excess neural excitation and allows the brain to transition between high-activity and low-activity states. Magnesium is a natural regulator of NMDA receptor activity, which is one of the main excitatory pathways in the brain. When magnesium is depleted, excitatory signaling goes unchecked. This is one of the reasons magnesium deficiency is associated with anxiety, hyperarousal, and difficulty winding down at night. It is also one of the reasons that coffee-induced jitteriness or anxiety in older adults often responds to magnesium replenishment. The excitatory system has lost one of its natural dampeners, and caffeine is pushing on a circuit that has lost its shock absorbers. The gut microbiome adds one more layer to this that is worth naming. Your intestinal microbiome, the several trillion bacteria living in your digestive tract, plays an active role in caffeine metabolism. Specific bacterial genera, including certain strains of Bacteroides and Bifidobacterium, produce enzymes that metabolize caffeine and its breakdown products. After 60, the gut microbiome loses diversity. A landmark study from University College Cork, published in Nature, documented that aging is associated with a reduction in beneficial bifidobacterium populations and an increase in less diverse pro-inflammatory microbial profiles. When the microbial species involved in caffeine metabolism are reduced, caffeine processing changes in ways that amplify the effects I described with CYP1A2. Slower clearance, more prolonged receptor occupation, faster tolerance development. The gut is not separate from the brain in this story. It is a participant in the same metabolic pathway. Now, the BDNF dimension, This reframes the entire coffee conversation and introduces the most compelling reason to add one specific compound. BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is a protein that functions like fertilizer for neurons. It supports the survival of existing brain cells, stimulates the formation of new neural connections, and is the molecular foundation for long-term memory consolidation. It is the reason aerobic exercise improves cognitive performance. Exercise is one of the most powerful inducers of BDNF release. It is also the reason chronic unmanaged stress degrades memory. Cortisol at chronically elevated levels suppresses BDNF production over time. BDNF levels decline measurably after 50 and continue declining through the 60s and beyond. A review published in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews documented significantly lower baseline BDNF concentrations in older adult populations compared to younger cohorts. This matters directly in the caffeine story because caffeine's cognitive benefits are not limited to blocking sleep pressure. Caffeine also stimulates BDNF production through its interaction with adenosine receptors. Adenosine receptor blockade in the hippocampus, the brain region most associated with memory and most vulnerable to age-related decline, activates downstream signaling pathways that include BDNF synthesis. One of the reasons coffee sharpens thinking is not just the alertness effect, it is a neurotrophic signal it was triggering through adenosine receptor modulation. When adenosine receptors are chronically upregulated due to long-term tolerance, the downstream BDNF signal weakens as well. Coffee stops producing its cognitive benefit not only because you built tolerance to the alertness effect, but because the deeper molecular pathway it was activating has been partially suppressed by the same tolerance mechanism. You need something that acts on the BDNF system more directly, something caffeine tolerance cannot blunt. This is the biological rationale for lion's mane mushroom, not as a wellness trend, as a specific pharmacological tool with mechanism data behind it. Hericium erinaceus contains two groups of compounds, hericenones and erinaceans, that cross the blood-brain barrier and directly stimulate NGF nerve growth factor and have shown BDNF stimulating activity in both preclinical studies and emerging clinical trials. A double-blind, placebo-controlled trial published in Phytotherapy Research in 2009, one of the earliest rigorous human studies, demonstrated significant improvements in cognitive function in adults over 50, given lion's mane extract at 1 gram per day across 16 weeks compared to placebo. The effect reached statistical significance at week 8 and continued through week 16. Critically, a 4-week follow-up after stopping supplementation showed a reversal of the benefit, a finding that rules out placebo effect and confirms that the cognitive improvement was tied to active compound consumption. More recent work from the University of Queensland in Australia, published in 2020, identified specific mechanisms by which lion's mane compounds enhanced memory formation through acetylcholine pathways in the hippocampus. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter most associated with focused attention and memory encoding. Aging significantly reduces cholinergic system efficiency. This is one of the reasons acetylcholinesterase inhibitor drugs are used in Alzheimer's treatment. A compound that supports cholinergic function in the hippocampus while simultaneously stimulating neurotrophic signaling addresses a gap that caffeine cannot fill. Adding lion's mane to a morning coffee routine for someone over 60 is not redundancy. It is reaching a system that caffeine tolerance has effectively taken offline. For practical sourcing, the lion's mane market is deeply inconsistent. Many consumer products contain ground-dried mushroom with minimal active compound concentration. Look for standardized extracts with labeled hericenone or erinacin content. The price difference between commodity lion's mane powder and a properly standardized extract reflects something real. This is one of the few supplement categories where the cheapest option is genuinely without clinical relevance. Here is where I want to pause before the protocol, because there is a section of this that I think matters more than the compounds themselves. I had read about the cortisol awakening response, the adenosine mechanism, the magnesium depletion. I had bookmarked papers in my browser for months after my husband first brought all of this to my attention. I understood it intellectually. It still did not translate into consistent behavior until he built me something structured to follow. He spent a long time taking the circadian biology research, including work that forms part of the foundation behind the Nobel Prize awarded in 2017 for discoveries in circadian rhythm mechanisms, and turning it into something usable without a background in cell biology. What he built is a 30-day daily companion called the Noon Reset Protocol. It follows four phases: adaptation, activation, optimization, acceleration, with 2 pages per day. 1 page of the science explaining what your body is doing in that specific phase. 1 page of a tracker. One of the sections I found most immediately useful was the Breakfast Meal Guide. 25 meal ideas with exact protein counts, because the timing of when you end the fast and what you break it with is where most of the circadian biology actually lives in daily practice. He made it available through the link in the description for less than a restaurant meal. I mention it here not as a detour, but because everything the weight curve protocol does works better inside a circadian framework that handles the timing piece alongside the coffee piece. They are not the same protocol, but they reinforce each other at the biological level. Now the creatine piece. Because this one surprises nearly everyone, most people hear creatine and picture a gym supplement intended for building muscle mass in young men. That association is decades out of date and is, in the context of cognitive aging, genuinely limiting. The research on creatine and brain function has been building since the early 2000s. A systematic review published in Nutrition Reviews in 2022 analyzed 18 controlled studies and concluded that creatine supplementation at 3 to 5 grams per day produced significant improvements in cognitive performance, with the effect size largest under conditions of sleep deprivation or cognitive stress, both of which describe the average adult over 60 who is relying on coffee to compensate for degraded slow-wave sleep. The mechanism is direct and requires no specialized framing. The brain uses ATP for every cognitive operation. Every neuron that fires, every signal transmitted across a synapse, every protein the brain synthesizes requires energy drawn from ATP reserves. Creatine phosphate is the fastest available ATP regeneration system in both muscle and brain tissue. When the brain is running under adenosine overload, elevated residual adenosine from insufficient glymphatic clearance, combined with partial caffeine tolerance, its creatine phosphate buffer depletes faster than it replenishes. Supplemental creatine expands that buffer. Think of it as a reserve battery, not the primary power source, but the system that extends functional time when the primary source is running at partial capacity. That reserve capacity is exactly what is most depleted in the chronically underslept, caffeine-dependent brain after 60. A 2021 study from the University of Sydney specifically tested creatine supplementation in older adults under sleep deprivation conditions. 5 grams per day significantly reduced cognitive performance decline compared to placebo. The researchers noted that older adults appeared to respond more robustly than younger subjects, a finding consistent with the biology, since older brains carry both lower baseline creatine stores and higher adenosine pressure to work against. Creatine tissue saturation takes approximately 3 to 4 weeks of consistent daily intake. The correct dose, 3 to 5 grams, does not need to be timed to the morning coffee. Steady-state saturation is what produces the benefit, and saturation is maintained by daily consistent intake rather than strategic timing. There is one additional dimension of the creatine data that I want to name explicitly because it is consistently omitted from popular coverage. Women have lower baseline skeletal muscle creatine stores than men, this is well established, and emerging data suggests lower brain creatine concentrations as well. A study in experimental gerontology from 2022 examined cognitive creatine effects specifically in postmenopausal women at 3 grams per day and found improvements in working memory and processing speed that were statistically significant compared to placebo. Women over 60 who dismiss creatine as a male-specific compound are declining the most relevant cognitive support data in the supplement literature based on an association that has nothing to do with the mechanism. The mechanism is identical across sexes: ATP buffer replenishment in a metabolically stressed brain. The baseline deficit may actually be deeper in older women, which potentially means the response is larger. The approximate cost of creatine monohydrate is somewhere around $20 for a supply lasting 3 months. It is one of the most thoroughly studied non-pharmaceutical compounds in existence, more clinical trial data than the vast majority of compounds marketed specifically to older adults for cognitive support. The cultural barrier keeping it out of the over 60 conversation is entirely non biological. Now, the wake curve protocol. 3 components, each one specific. The common mistake that invalidates the entire system if left uncorrected. Component 1 is the 90-minute delay. Do not drink coffee in the first 90 minutes after waking. This is not a willpower exercise. It is a cortisol window protection strategy. In the first 45 to 60 minutes after waking, your cortisol awakening response is either producing its natural spike or, in the case of most adults over 60, attempting to produce a diminished version of one. If you introduce caffeine during that window, you suppress the internal signal and train the adrenal axis toward increasingly blunted morning output over time. Waiting 90 minutes allows whatever cortisol awakening response remains to complete its arc, allows natural adenosine to build to a level that caffeine can meaningfully address, and means the caffeine you consume will produce a genuine effect rather than stacking on top of a cortisol peak that has already done most of the work. The practical implementation: wake, drink 2 glasses of water immediately, take 20 to 30 minutes of movement. A walk at conversational pace is sufficient. Eat a protein-based breakfast with at least 30 grams of protein, and then have coffee. Most people who commit to this for 2 weeks report that a single cup does what 2 or 3 used to require. Component 2 is the L-theanine stack. Add 200 milligrams of L-theanine to your morning coffee, not as a separate supplement at a different time, combined in the same preparation or taken simultaneously. L-theanine is the amino acid responsible for the distinctly different cognitive experience green tea produces compared to coffee. Despite containing caffeine, green tea users describe calm alertness, sustained focus without jitteriness, and a longer, smoother energy curve. The mechanism is that L-theanine increases alpha brainwave activity, the wave pattern associated with relaxed alertness, present when you are focused on a task but not anxious, while also supporting GABAergic signaling and reducing the excessive excitatory activity that caffeine can trigger through norepinephrine pathways. A meta-analysis in nutritional neuroscience pooled data from multiple randomized controlled trials and confirmed that the caffeine plus theanine combination produces superior sustained attention, faster response times, and reduced error rates compared to caffeine alone, with consistent results across studies. The ratio with the most clinical support is 200 milligrams of L-theanine per 100 milligrams of caffeine. A standard cup of drip coffee contains roughly 95 to 100 milligrams. Start there. What you will notice within the first week is not a dramatic increase in alertness. It is the absence of the mid-morning jitteriness and the absence of the sharp early afternoon drop. The energy curve flattens and extends. Consistent, sustainable alertness is cognitively more valuable than a sharp peak followed by a valley. Component 3 is the evening magnesium window. This is not part of the morning coffee ritual, but it is structurally the most important component of the wake curve protocol because it repairs the system the morning coffee is trying to run on. Take 300 to 400 milligrams of magnesium glycinate or magnesium L-threonate 45 to 60 minutes before bed. Not magnesium oxide. The bioavailability of oxide forms is approximately 4%, making it functionally useless for replenishment purposes. Glycinate forms have high absorption rates and strong evidence for sleep quality improvement. Magnesium L-threonate has an additional property. It crosses the blood-brain barrier more efficiently than other forms and has been studied specifically in older adults for effects on synaptic density and cognitive function, with a clinical trial published in Aging and Disease in 2016 finding significant improvements in overall cognitive function after 12 weeks in adults averaging 69 years of age. The evening magnesium replenishes what daily coffee has been depleting, supports melatonin synthesis, improves slow-wave sleep quality, and, over 4 to 6 weeks of consistent use, begins to restore some of the glymphatic clearance capacity that degraded sleep had compromised. When slow-wave sleep improves, residual adenosine in the morning decreases. When morning adenosine is lower, caffeine needs to do less work. When caffeine needs to do less work, smaller doses produce real effects, tolerance plateaus, and the afternoon dependency cycle begins to break. The common mistake that invalidates the entire protocol is implementing components 2 and 3 while continuing to drink coffee in the first hour of waking. Every element of the wake curve protocol is contingent on the 90-minute delay. Without the timing shift, the L-theanine is buffering caffeine that is actively suppressing a cortisol response it should be protecting. The magnesium improves sleep architecture, but if caffeine timing is still pushing active caffeine into late evening hours, given the slower CYP1A2 metabolism after 60, the improved magnesium will partially offset the caffeine-driven sleep disruption rather than transcending it. The 90-minute delay is load-bearing for the entire structure. Remove it, and the other two components produce partial benefit at best. I want to return to where this started, because there is a closing loop worth naming. The glymphatic system needs slow-wave sleep to run. Slow-wave sleep is undermined by late-timed caffeine, by magnesium depletion, and by the compounding adenosine pressure of a system that never fully winds down. When my husband was at the worst of his health, running a company on 4 hours of sleep, on 3 medications, managing cholesterol numbers that had his cardiologist genuinely concerned, he was doing every wrong thing simultaneously. Coffee immediately upon waking, coffee in the afternoon, no magnesium replenishment, sleeping less than 6 hours on most nights. His doctors managed the numbers. Nobody addressed the system underneath the numbers. I am not saying the medications were wrong. Under medical supervision, carefully, over years, by understanding the mechanisms rather than only the symptoms, he rebuilt his metabolic baseline into something that now requires a fraction of what it once did in pharmaceutical support. His cardiologist remains actively involved because that is what responsible management looks like, and results vary significantly between individuals. I say this not to offer a formula, but to explain why I became allergic to surface-level advice and obsessive about mechanisms. The mechanism is where the leverage actually lives. $3 billion per year are spent globally on sleep aids. Enormous amounts are spent annually on cardiovascular and metabolic medications. A significant portion of those problems sit downstream from mechanisms as specific as adenosine receptor upregulation from CYP1A2 slowdown, cortisol awakening response suppression from decades of poor caffeine timing, and chronic magnesium depletion from daily coffee consumption without replenishment. This is not a claim that coffee causes disease. It is a claim that not understanding your coffee relationship at the mechanistic level costs far more over decades than the small amount of information required to use the tool correctly. If you are going to start the wake curve protocol this week, 90-minute delay, L-theanine at the morning cup, magnesium glycinate in the evening, comment wake curve below so I can see who is actually implementing this. I want to know who in this community is at the stage where they are ready to change the one ritual that feels most psychologically defended. And if you have not yet watched the video on how breakfast timing changes fat metabolism after 50, the circadian biology it covers connects directly to everything the adenosine and cortisol systems we covered today depend on. They are different mechanisms. They run on the same clock.